Hi, guys. Welcome to Northpointe Plus. We are on the big episode of 144. My name is Jenna Dufresne, and I have the great pleasure of being the children's minister here at Northpointe Community Church. And to my left, I have Mr. Rick
You have
Rubel.
the great pleasure of having Rick Rubel.
I know. So formal. So formal.
Yes.
How are you doing?
Good. I'm good.
Are you recovered after your Kenya trip and
I'm
feeling
still
refreshed?
I actually think I'm still fighting an infection. So, but just normal cold stuff, not any Kenyan germs. So,
just in case, we got to let people know that.
yep, that's correct.
Yeah.
I'm doing fine.
Yeah. What was your favorite thing about going to Kenya?
Oh, is this the Kenya broadcast?
It is not, but I am curious.
I think my highlight of the entire trip was, it's really tough. It was really, really cool to meet the boy Muhammad that we helped sponsor. That was incredibly cool. But I think my highlight was when we pulled into Chumani the first time, and they had sent video, and I had seen the video of the building there, but seeing the building and the kids singing and the other kids cheering on the side as we pulled in was just really, really powerful. Good stuff.
Yeah, and I love on the team that went, it was ordinary people who have your typical jobs, and that kind of goes into what you taught about this Sunday.
Yeah.
Like my leeway in there.
Yeah, that was a good segue.
Thank you. That was
Good.
my broadcasting from high school right there.
Yeah, there you go. Good segue.
So that kind of gives us a little bit of a summary of what you talked about on Sunday.
So we finished the Elijah series, which is interesting because Elijah is such a significant player in the Old Testament, but there's not really there are other characters in the Old Testament that have more time, more stories, more space on the page, if you will. But so it was the fourth message in the Elijah series, and it was really about Elijah going and transferring his position, his blessing to Elisha, and what all was involved in that. And for me, it's funny when I was doing the prep for the message, lots of people have lots of different takes on 1 Kings 19 and teach it in different ways. For me, the biggest thing was here was a guy who invested in somebody else so that the ministry, so that God could continue to work after he was gone. And he did, and I didn't really spend any time at all talking about the miracle of Elijah going into heaven and never dying. We didn't really spend any time on that at all. Right. But primarily on the whole process of Elijah pouring it into Elisha, and Elisha eventually taking that role on.
Yeah, so we have quite a bit of questions over what you taught about on Sunday. And our first one is wearing the mantle of leadership a burden. First, can you explain why the word mantle is used?
Yeah, where that came from. So in 1 Kings 19, it talks about Elijah as he goes out. He finds Elisha in a field. He's one of 12 guys who are behind yokes of oxen that are plowing a field, and he basically takes his cloak, his mantle, places it on Elisha's shoulders, and then just keeps walking. And it really is a significant symbol to say what Elijah has been doing, Elisha is going to take over and take that role. It's the mantle of leadership. That phrase really comes from this passage of Scripture. And it's a phrase that's used in culture, not just church world, but in business culture or whatever. But that's where it comes from. So this idea of the mantle of leadership, is it a burden? Is really kind of an interesting question, because I think there is a sense in which it is. I've said before, I think before you joined staff, in a message a couple of years ago, I said, one of the things that surprised me and kind of took me back some was when somebody said, oh, the first day that you serve as lead pastor is the last day anybody tells you the full truth, which was, it's true of any senior leadership position that all of a sudden everything gets filtered in a little bit different way than it did before. And so in that sense, there is a burden of leadership because the decisions that you make and the way that God uses you impacts lots of people in lots of different ways. And so you want to make sure that you're being faithful, that you're responding in the right way, and that you're hearing God clearly as you move forward. And so there is, in that sense, a burden, but it's also a joy. It's, for me, if I go back to Kenya, to the Kenya team, it was just a really cool thing to help facilitate the trip and to see how God used the trip to impact the other 13 people who were on the team and to impact what was going on in Chumani and in the greater work of Mohi, and to know that in my role as a leader, I had just a little piece of how God was bringing all that together. And so it's not all a heavy burden. I think that there's a tremendous amount of fulfillment and joy that comes in that, but there's a big responsibility that comes with it too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think going into ministry, one of the scariest verses for me was like it's in 1st or 2nd Timothy about like the expectation of, of somebody who is in leadership. And it's like, well, like it's a lot. It's, I going into my year 1 now tomorrow on Wednesday, the official year 1.
First anniversary
Of many. And while there's this like shock of, like my words have a way bigger meaning than it did as a leader, as a volunteer. My, my actions have a bigger meaning than it was as just a small group leader to a second grader. And so I think that's the difference of you see your influence a little bit more. Yeah. But then you also, on the flip side, get to see a lot of wins that a lot of people don't get to see. And so. Yeah,
James 3, James says, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that as such you'll incur a stricter judgment. That there's that sense of burden, but also the sense that as you teach, you see people get stuff, and that's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah. My favorite part, this Sunday, we had a Jesus party, and you saw like this little click in the kiddos of seeing like Jesus has a party for us. Yeah. And he wants us to be a part of that party, and that's kind of that little click that you get to kind of see in a different way. Yeah. So our second question, do you think Christian t-shirts are bad?
I made a comment in the message about having a mantle, a figurative mantle, a symbolic mantle that we wear somehow that distinguishes us, that God's hand is on us, and that we have a role, and just challenging people to think about what that is. And so I made this comment about Christian t-shirts because I think a lot of Christians think, oh, that's my witnessing tool, and maybe it can be. I think for a lot of people who are not Christians, they look at Christian t-shirts and think, come on, you can do better than that. Which is why I like when I wear stuff, I like stuff that will create a conversation. Yeah. As opposed to something that maybe gives the answer. So like I had a t-shirt, I designed a t-shirt at a previous church that we used for events that the front of it just said ask. That's all it said. Didn't have anything else. It did have the logo of the church, but it was a pretty nondescript kind of logo on the back. And when we gave them out, I said, okay, this is for an event, so that anybody who comes to the event knows that they can ask you questions. But I want you to wear them out to the store. I want you to wear them school. I want you to wear them wherever, because people will say, ask what? And then you can say, ask anything you want. And it can start a conversation. I like that kind of t-shirt better than the ones that have like, the red shirt that has like the Heinz logo on it that says "Catch Up with Jesus."
So you're talking more about like your cringy ones, which I will say, when I first became a Christian, I will admit I was like, my Jeep Margell t-shirts that I'm on a drive with Jesus. Yeah. I have many of those. But like there are definitely ones that a non-Christian would be like, okay. And then there are some, even as a Christian, when I went to Liberty, there was a a sweatshirt. Kids were selling it. It said salt and light. And I was like, to a non-Christian, that's super weird. What are you? You know, and so that's a conversation starter. I also remember when I was visiting Northpointe, I was getting on the flight and I had my Jesus t-shirt on. And it says like something about like love everyone or something like that. Then on the back, it says like, dear person behind me, you know, I want you to know like Jesus loves you. And somebody walked up to me and she goes, you don't know how much I needed to hear that.
Oh, that's fun.
And so it's those interesting things of some are really cringy. And some,
I'm not opposed to them, but I think that it just becomes a secondary tool. When we think that that's our thing, I don't think that that's nearly as significant as people who can see us authentically loving other people and being compassionate, being gracious, that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so everybody should bring a Christian t-shirt and drop it off in Frick's mailbox.
Yeah.
So getting into question number 3. So you kind of hinted at, do you think Elijah's depression and loneliness ended when God sent him to have Elisha as his helper? Or do you think there's a relationship between pouring into others, mentoring, and a lessening of depression?
Yeah, say that again. Ask that question again.
Yeah, so you kind of hinted at, we'll start with the first part. Do you think Elijah's depression and loneliness ended when God sent him to have Elisha as his helper?
I do think, I think, and then the last part of that, do I think there's a connection? I do think that there is a connection that happens that when we're depressed, when we're lonely, when we're isolated, that when we begin to give of ourselves and to invest in others, when we begin to do what God's called us to do, that the impact of that is lessened. That a lot of times, and let me just give it with a caveat. If it's not chemically induced, like a chemical imbalance kind of thing, the depression, that when we take our eyes off ourselves and put it on someone else, that all of a sudden everything changes. I think we stop having pity parties. We begin to see how significant we are. And God uses that in some powerful ways. I've seen that in myself. I've seen it in lots of other people. And so I do think that there is a sense that if you're watching or listening and you think, you're just kind of down, that maybe the step that you need to take is to say, how can I pour into somebody else and let God use me in that way, and then just see what happens.
Yeah, that's why I love how we do life groups, because even your leader that's there, they're not like the one like leading it.
Yeah,
you know, they're the one hosting it and like facilitating it. So like if you are in this space where you're like, man, I'm not, I'm kind of just out of it, and we've all been there. Get into a life group, because that is a perfect place to start, where you might find your mentor, like Chris, said on Sunday. That's how she found her mentor, is through a life group. And so joining it in that way could be a great first step to finding a mentor or someone who you will mentor.
We didn't talk about this, but if you haven't watched the message, there's in the message, my wife Deb and Chris Sullivan both talked about being involved in mentoring relationships. And so if you didn't watch the message, go back and just watch that part, because that part's worth it in gold. Yeah.
Yeah. Who was your first mentor?
Who was my first mentor? I think there was a high school teacher who invested in me significantly, but in college, there were probably 3 different people on staff that poured into me a ton, and that shaped my view of ministry, my experience in ministry, and their imprint on me continues now, 45 years later, in some cool ways. Yeah,
mine, I had a high school teacher. Her name was Terry Durnell. She wasn't a Christian. Long story, but she was the one who literally was like, Jenna, like God's going to use you, and there's no doubt in my mind. And that was the mentor in a different way of bringing that confidence of what God's going to do. And so it's crucial, because she believed in me and mentored me up in that confidence of God. That's how I was able to feel confident enough to pursue ministry.
I didn't say this in the message, and it was kind of in my notes. It was in my head, but it never really came out. I think it's easy, particularly when we're young, or even as we look back, to say, like for me, my parents were significant mentors for me. My dad was probably my chief mentor. It's interesting to me that Elisha's parents are there and involved enough that Elisha wants to say goodbye to him, but he needed someone else besides his parents to have that role. And so it really is, it's a great thing to have godly parents who can invest in you, but to recognize there are other people that need to invest in you as well, and that you need to learn and grow from to broaden your base, as my dad would say, broaden your base.
Broaden your base.
Yeah.
So Elisha burnt the yoke for his oxen and sacrificed the oxen. You mentioned the one-way missionaries who bought one-way tickets and packed their belongings in their coffin when they left as missionaries, knowing they would never return. Isn't there another example of someone who burnt their boats?
Yeah, there's a cool story in there, but let me just pause before I get there in a second. Because different world, we don't think this way now. Yeah. But if you think about missionaries that had to get on a ship and go across the ocean or to the islands or whatever to share the good news about Jesus, that I just think it would have been really interesting for the people who worked on the boat. Okay, we have coffins that are coming. What's that about? Yeah. And they've got their coffins in storage with the people's stuff. Just really kind of an interesting dynamic and interesting experience. But that those people would go, knowing that they were never going to come home. Yep. So the question in their story about burning boats or whatever, Cortez, Hernando Cortez in 1519 was a Spanish conqueror. They came to the New World, and he and his team, I think as I read about him, again, it didn't make it in the message, but I think his crew was all about plundering the New World and taking the treasure back to Spain. Cortez wanted to conquer the New World. Yeah. And those were two very different concepts, because Cortez, once they landed and came on shore, he had them burn their ship. He set the ships on fire, their boats on fire, so that they couldn't return to Spain. And basically he was saying, no, we are not here to plunder and to go back. We're here to conquer. And when he did that, it was a game changer, because it was like, no, if it's tough, if it's hard, if we don't like it, guess what?
Suck it up, buttercup.
Yep. There is no going back, and that is what Elisha did. So when he burns the yoke to his oxen and then sacrifices his oxen, those are the tools that provide for him in his occupation as a farmer. And so to take those away, there was no going back except to serve and take care of Elijah. That was his new mission, his new job.
Yeah. So is this kind of like telling us that God's telling us to quit our job and quit without having another job lined up then? Or is it?
It's really interesting, because I think that is a potential application. And it is really interesting that today, that question is out of Sunday's message. Today, I found out about a person that I care deeply about that Friday night wrestled with God about a situation at work and really felt like God said, you know what, you need to quit your job. And they said, I don't have a job lined up. Right. And just really sensed that God was saying, do you think that I'll take care of you or not? And then on Saturday turned in their notice and quit their job. Got a family to take care of, mortgage, the whole deal, but really are trusting that God's going to provide for them, confident that was God speaking.
Oh, yeah.
Excuse me.
It's hard when you're in the trenches. You got to trust it. It's easier said than done.
Yeah.
The Lord's going to be there with you.
Yep.
It's easier said than done. But the Bible shows lots of examples of how he will always
Yeah.
provide. So our fifth question from Mr. Jason Bowles. So why
Jason Bowles Jr.
Jason Bowles Jr.
Yeah, which is great. Really cool. Yeah.
So why was Elisha allowed to go and say his goodbyes to his parents and community when later on in Jesus's earthly ministry, he tells another man, "Let the dead bury the dead"?
Yeah, it is really interesting. Again, this didn't make it into the message. In Luke chapter 9, there's this passage where Jesus and the disciples are walking. They're heading towards Jerusalem, and this guy says, "I'll follow you, Jesus, wherever you go." Jesus says, "Foxes have dens to live in, birds have their nests. Son of Man has no place to lay his head." And another person, Jesus says, "Come follow me." And the man says, "Let me first return home and bury my father." And then Jesus said, "Let the dead bury the dead, the spiritually dead bury their own dead. Your duty is to go and preach about the kingdom of God." And to another, the person says, "Lord, I'll follow you, but let me first say goodbye to my family." And Jesus said, "Anybody who puts his hand to the plow and then looks back isn't fit for the kingdom of God." That seems like it's in complete conflict with what happens with Elijah and Elisha. Now I can tell you everything that I read about this, and again, it didn't make it in the message because I just didn't have time to really go there. Most scholars would say the difference really was Elisha wasn't creating an excuse. He wasn't delaying the process. What he was wanting to do was to finish well.
Yep.
That he wanted to honor his parents. He wanted to just say goodbye and take off and go with Elijah, knowing that relationship would change completely, and was ready to do that. And that the guy who asked Jesus that was making excuses and saying, "Oh yeah, I'll get to you eventually," and Jesus was saying, "No, it's a burn your boats kind of a thing."
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I spent a lot of time studying because Elijah's words that he used, I think, are a little bit hard to know. Elijah could have sarcastically said, "Yeah, sure, you go ahead and go back, but you better be thinking about what I've asked you to do."
Yeah.
And it's kind of a acquiescence, that he says, "Yeah, it's okay if you want to go back. That's probably not the right path." But he allows him to do that. But then the minus the wording about the fact that he sacrifices the oxen and that they basically have a town barbecue, there's not. It doesn't say that he went back and said goodbye to his parents. It says that it does say that he immediately burnt the yoke, sacrificed the bull, everybody ate it, and then he left. And so I think that there is a little bit of white space in trying to figure out exactly what happened. Now, let me just go a little bit different direction. And my wife, after I had talked to her about this, said, "You don't need to say that, but I'm going to say it anyway." It's interesting to me that earlier in Luke 9, so this precedes this passage that Jesus has as he's having the conversation with people about following Jesus, about following him and giving up everything to follow him. Earlier in Luke 9 is when Jesus is on what we call the Mount of Transfiguration, and Elijah and Moses appear with him. It's right before that. And I think when Jesus says, "Anybody who puts his hand to the plow and looks back," I think that probably triggered some things in the listeners' ears about Elijah and Elisha. I think that there was a connection for them that it was like, oh, this really means a complete change of everything.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to put all those pieces together, but I do think that in that interaction, as people ask that and Jesus said that, people would have been talking. Peter, James, and John would have been talking about what happened on the Mount of Transfiguration, and that Jesus was there and that Elijah was there.
Yeah.
And I think that would have been something that was very fresh in their minds when he said that.
Because wasn't in Jewish tradition, Elijah was a very highly,
Yeah.
like, you don't mess around.
Yeah,
That's
it
not me.
really is Moses and Elijah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the Abraham,
Yeah.
the primary figures in the Old Testament. Yeah.
Yeah. So with it, keep diving into the answer, keep searching.
Yep.
The Bible is always going to have different little things
Yeah.
you can figure out.
Stuff that you can continue to study and process. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. So we have another submitted question. So Rick talked that was awkward. Talked about a mentee searching for a mentor, but in Elijah's story, the mentor sought out the mentee. How do we know whether to search for a mentee or a mentor?
I would say this, and that's a really good question. And I actually was pretty intentional to say, as somebody who wants to be mentored, you've got to take the initiative to try and find someone who can pour into you.
Yeah.
I think because from my end, I think it's all about personal responsibility. You take in responsibility for being in that kind of relationship.
Yeah.
I would also say the same thing is true in terms of finding someone to pour into. That I think there is this sense that we as followers of Jesus are always thinking about, God, who do you want me to help develop? Who do you want me to pour into so that they can come in and take my spot? So it's a natural thing. It really is a part of the fiber of stuff at Northpointe that we talk about as staff and leaders, to say, who are our next level leaders? Who are the people who can do what you're doing, who you can train to take your role so that God can allow you to do something else and maybe have a greater impact. So I think that we have a responsibility to mentor others, to find people to pour into. But I think that we also have a responsibility to go looking for people who can pour into us and finding the right person who can do that as well.
Yeah, I remember when I was in college and Dr. Brennan's class, it was like my women's leadership class, and she said a lot of times there are plenty of young women who want to be mentored. There's not always enough older women who want to mentor. So I think it's like that both double hand. We need to have both sides equal, ready to go.
Yeah, and
it's not hard to find a mentor.
Yeah,
I've found personally.
I think like if I think about Deb and Chris, I would. It's part of, I think, why I believe in life groups are so important for just people growing. And there's something that's excuse me, something that's very positive and helpful about being in a life group with people who are in the same life stage as you. But there's also something really healthy about having people who are not in the same life stage as you, and that mentoring relationship just happens naturally because you're doing life together and you're asking questions. So you're raising babies, but you've got somebody else in the life group that is at the grandparent level that has been through that stage, that can help bring some perspective to the stuff that you're struggling with. Yeah. That you've got somebody who is maybe single in a dating relationship or whatever, and you've got some other people who have been married a long time to say, oh, watch out for this landmine, do this, make sure that you do that kind of thing. That there's something that's real powerful that can happen as the relationship grows naturally, rather than just looking out and saying, oh, that's the person I want to mentor me, and you don't really have any relationship with them at all. That can happen. God can work through that. Yeah. But I think it tends to happen more often in the context of existing relationships. So you've got to be in relationships with people that are in front of you and behind you. Yeah.
Perfect. And then our last question is, can you explain more about the double portion of blessing that Elisha asked for?
Yeah. I didn't end up having enough time to really talk about it the way that I want to. Yeah. In Old Testament culture, there was this clear sense that a blessing was handed down from a father to a son. The oldest son got a double portion. So like if you had 4 sons, Your daughters didn't get anything in the Old Testament, but the estate, the father's estate would essentially, if you had 4 sons, be divided into 5 equal parts, and the oldest son would get 2 of those parts, a double portion compared to everybody else. And so when Elisha asks for, when Elijah says, "Is there anything else that you want?" and Elisha says, "Yeah, could I have a double portion of your blessing?" It was a recognition that Elijah had poured into him already, and he was asking for God's presence, for God's blessing to come through Elijah twice as much as what he had already gotten.
Yeah.
Even as Elijah rides the chariot up into heaven. And what's interesting is that they have this conversation. There are prophets kind of watching from the side. Elijah goes into heaven. Elisha gets Elijah's cloak, hits it on the Jordan River in the same way that Elijah had, and the exact same thing happens. The water parts, and he's able to walk through on dry ground, which is pretty cool. But then when you read 2 Kings, and I just made a kind of a rough reference to this, all of the miracles that Elijah is involved in that are recorded in 1 Kings, what Scripture records about Elisha is that Elisha did twice as many miracles as Elijah, and many of them the same thing. Elisha also raises someone from the dead. Elisha also asks God to provide resources for food in the same way that he did with Elijah with the widow of Zarephath, and the jars just keep being filled up and filled up and filled up, miraculous kind of things. But twice as many miracles happened through Elisha as did through Elijah. And there is just a really cool sense that that Elisha asked for the right thing, and God honored that. I mentioned this at the end of the message. It's just really interesting to me that oftentimes in our culture in particular, when you are mentored, when you grow and develop, that there comes a time that you say, "Daggone it, I want my spot. I want to become the CEO now. I want to be the manager now. I want to do whatever. It's time. It is my time." And there's this sense of entitlement that's there. And none of that's true with Elisha.
Yeah.
Elisha instead is basically saying, "No, Elijah, I'm not letting you go see those prophets by yourself. I'm not leaving you alone."
Right.
And his love for him keeps him with Elijah. And the last thing that he asks is, "Could I have twice as much as what you've already given me, so that God can use me in an even greater way?" And that happens. And Elijah recognizes that happens at God's hand, not because Elijah says so, which is a really cool thing.
Awesome. Well, do you have anything else to add based off of your sermon or any other thing?
No, if you're watching this week, I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, sign up for the Global Leadership Summit. I'm wearing the swag. I don't know if you can see. Oh, I'm behind. That's behind my thing. Global Leadership Summit is an incredible opportunity to just grow as a father, as a dad, as a husband, as a mom, as a wife, as an employee, as a leader. There's going to be so much good stuff this year. And if you register this week, actually through next Tuesday, Tuesday the 17th, and if you use the code GLSHOST24, GLSHOST24, and you put the organization as Northpointe, the price goes from $209 to $139, so it's significant. It's a third off what it is right now, and I would just encourage you to do that. We've got, I think right now we've got pretty close to 40 from Northpointe who are signed up, and right now we're pushing about 120 total, and would love to have 200, and so be sure and get that done.
Yeah. Like my grandma always says, a deal.
It's a deal.
It's a deal.
It's a deal. Got to take advantage of the deal.
Of course. Well, thank you guys for joining us, and we will see you this Sunday and see you next on our podcast.